Welcome to this lecture on the development of polyphony. Early polyphony can be found in treatises where there were instructions showing people how to improvise polyphony. Polyphony was a way of expanding upon existing melodies, in these cases existing chant. There are three important features of early polyphony. During the Middle Ages, all polyphony was based on plain chant, at least the polyphony that we find in these printed sources. 2. Polyphony was only sung on the most important feast days of the liturgical year. And then polyphony was only added to the sections of chant that would have been sung by the soloist. So only the better singers would sing polyphony. In terms of the Mass, it would be primarily the responsorial chants that had polyphony added. The responsorial chants are the chants in the middle part of the Mass that follow the reading of the texts of the epistle especially. And then in response to those readings, whatever material was covered in those readings, then the chants would enhance or add on to the message being conveyed in the readings. The history of polyphony starts around 900 with a genre of polyphony called organum. Organum is when you have a chant melody with added parts or voices either beneath or above in note against note motion. Now, there are different ways that this could happen. So I'm going to show you an example now of some music, some notation that shows how organum worked, at least from a improvisational standpoint. Again, remember that this practice was based on oral tradition, meaning people did this by ear. When there was a chant melody being sung, other singers would then sing above or below the original voice. So here in this example, even if you can't read music, you can still see that there are two notes here at parallel distances. The principal voice is the top voice, that's the original melody, and then this part was added underneath at these parallel intervals. This is what that would sound like, and this is, for those that know music theory, a perfect fifth series of intervals here. So all these are at the fifth. Here's what this would sound like. So you can see it has a more resonant type of sound to it. Now, in some cases, the added parts could be at varying distances. So in this example down here, example 3.2, we have some intervals that are in unison. So these two first that are side by side are unison, and then expand to a second, a third, a fourth, and then they stay at the interval of a fourth for a while. So the intervals just start close and then they expand, and this is what that would sound like. Okay, so you hear some differences in terms of the consonants and dissonance between various intervals. Now this example here is a little bit more elaborate. We see the notes going in contrary motion and sometimes parallel motion, so they go in different directions, and so that's what this is talking about. Sometimes the motion between the parts is parallel, meaning like contrary. So if one voice or one part goes down in pitch, the lower one, for instance, can go up, and that's called contrary motion when each part is going in different directions. When they're both going in the same directions, that's called parallel motion. And similar motion over here is something where one part goes down just a little bit while another one goes down much further. In that example there, oblique is when one part stays the same while other parts move around. So there's all these different terms for indicating motion. And then we're starting to get into this concept of counterpoint, where notes are working against one another based on a certain set of parameters or rules. So this is what this sounds like, this free organum example with a bunch of different contours in terms of each of the melodies. Okay, so those were some examples of what was going on in Organum in the development of early polyphony. So it's a mixture of concepts there, some parallel, some mixed. Interesting there. Early polyphony started to develop in the 12th century in Aquitaine or southwestern, what we know now as southwestern France. There were two types of polyphony, melismatic organum and discant organum. I'm going to go over these again in a second, so I'm going to skip on to this next segment. Now, by the late 12th century into the early 13th century, the styles of organum were then brought to the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And then there is a treatise that many scholars reference by someone called Anonymous 4, and he talks about a couple of composers, Leoninus and Perotinus, being the best composers of certain styles of polyphony. Leoninus being the best composer of organum, which we just heard examples of, and then Perotinus being the best composer of discant. I'm going to talk about what that is in a minute. So the book that a lot of these compositions come from is called the Magnus Liber Organi, or the Great Book of Organum, and it's a collection of music from the Catholic liturgy. So, and there's also music for Mass, the Catholic Mass, and then there's also music for the daily office, meaning music that would be sung by the members of the church community when Mass wasn't taking place on basically day to day. And a lot of this polyphony was used for major feast days, so they're important days on the liturgical calendar. Let's see, there are two types or styles of polyphony found in the Magnus Liber Organi. One is melismatic organum, also known as pure organum, and this is when we have a chant melody in what's called the tenor voice with melismas above. I'm going to show you an example of that. Let me just pull up the document here. So melismatic organum in notation looks like this. Even if you don't read, you can see, even if you don't read music, you can see that the lower part here, it has the word starting on the first syllable of the word vidrunt. That note is going to be held kind of like a drone, while the upper part sings all of these notes, and that's when a voice sings multiple notes or on one syllable. That's called a melisma or melismatic style. So that's a good term to know. And so the whole beginning of this piece starts with melismatic organum. Now, another style of organum is called discant organum. That's when we have a chant melody in the bottom voice moving in long note values, but both the parts, the bottom part and the upper part, are in a rhythmic pattern. So basically that's going to look like this, and it's going to sound a little bit different than the melismatic organum section. So let me pull up a section here. So up here we have notation where the notes are moving a little faster and there's rhythmic patterns being performed. So I'm going to show you some examples of these in this source here. Let me just pull this up. Okay. Here's let's move to the next example actually. So now here is the let me just back up here. So here's the opening of the piece I just showed you, but here's a little clear version of it. So we're going to have a low voice just sustaining this one note. This lower voice is called the tenor. Tenor literally means to hold, while the upper voices are going to move in this melismatic passage. So let's listen to what this sounds like. mixture of consonant tones and dissonant sounds going on throughout this passage. It's pretty interesting. So as the notes change, you hear different levels of consonance and dissonance. So that's the melismatic organum example there. Okay. The next example is what we call discant organum, and this is called discant clausula. Clausula is like a distinct or a separate section within a larger piece. So this is an example of discant organum. So we're going to notice that these notes in both parts are a little bit more rhythmic, so there's a little bit more of a rhythmic drive and lilt to this. So let's listen to what this sounds like. And also we're going to hear that the bottom melody, although moving a little bit more slowly, has some contour to it versus being just one drone or one droning note or held note. Okay. So those are some examples of the organum and the development of early polyphony. Now I want to show you this musical score of this whole piece to show you how the piece is arranged. So it starts off in melismatic organum in the beginning, and we heard an example of that. So we have the long notes in the tenor, we have the melismas over the top, very elaborate type of a texture. And then we have a section in discant where we have these faster, more moving, more rhythmic ideas. Then it returns to melismatic organum for a while in here. Then in this section, the piece goes to monophonic chant. So the whole choir, and this just sounds like regular, or what we call normal Gregorian chant melody. So this is not polyphony in this section. This is just monophonic. Everyone's singing the same thing. Although we do have some bits of this that are melismatic, but it's not polyphony. Then this section returns to melismatic organum, so we have a single note being held in the tenor while there's many notes being sung in the upper part on a single syllable. And so that continues for a while. The notes in the tenor can change periodically, but it's pretty much they're held for quite a while. This section is in discant again, so we have quicker moving rhythmic ideas and rhythmic patterns happening. It's a little more lilting sounding, and then we have the piece returning to melismatic organum at the end. Another little bit discant here and there. So the point is that the texture changes and it creates a lot of interest in terms of the composition. So that is what was happening with the development of polyphony in the church, at least. And these things again were based on oral tradition, and then these examples in the Magnus Liber Organi were basically showing people how to improvise or how to perform this new idea or this new concept in composition called organum. So that's a major innovation in terms of the notation of music and how things were basically developing during the time period. So I'm going to push on now to another concept. Okay, so we had just talked about the development of polyphony in a sacred music context. And then that polyphony was certainly isolated to a certain region, what we now know is France. But that spread over time, but it took a while for those practices to be distributed. Now, I want to talk about another concept happening around the same time in the kind of the mid to late Middle Ages, the Crusades. So there were Crusades between 1095 and 1270. The Crusades were a war initiated by the Roman Catholic Church to take back the Holy Land from the Saracens. So the Crusades had some valuable consequences. It caused unity between rulers. It allowed Europeans to acquire lots of wealth. So they increased wealth and increased the standards of living, at least for the wealthy people. But out of this, we get the codes of chivalry, and then out of that, all of these things happening through the Crusades, the development of courts. So the court concept is really about the social life of the nobility. So what the ruling class within any particular state, region, area. A court, by definition, is a physical location where the nobility basically spends most of their time living, working, socializing, doing everything that they need to do to exist, basically. It's the seat of politics, the seat of social life. The court serves as one of the most important patrons of the arts. So they hire musicians, they have music in the court, both sacred and secular, so religious and non-religious music. The arts were then centralized by the court. And then here we have the major patrons of music and the arts, of course, the church, the court, and then the public. Of course, there was music making within the public from as far back as history can take us. So, but anyway, we don't have evidence of that music because either if it was written down, it didn't survive, or it wasn't written down. It was all based on oral tradition. So, but that just know that the examples of music we look at are examples that were printed, that were maintained through different sources, through copying by hand primarily. And the church was had an agenda to maintain its music, and also to try to codify it and make it a kind of a consistent sense of culture. In the court setting, we get these musicians, these noble musicians called troubadours. They are composers and singers. They are of noble birth, and they wrote a lot of songs. Usually they were educated, so they could write their poetry down. Most of these songs that the troubadours wrote, we have in text form, but some do actually have melodies. So there's some evidence of that. Now I'm just going to skip on down here and talk about troubadour songs. One of the most common topics in troubadour songs, and trouveries were another type of troubadour from the northern part of what we now know as France. But the main topic in the poetry of troubadour songs was courtly love, which was founded on two premises. One, that marriages were arranged, so therefore they were passionless. And then the other concept was that love was considered a sickness. So, and the cure to this sickness was to acknowledge it through poetry and song. So we have a lot of the poetry in the songs that we look at from the troubadour repertoire is talking about courtly love. So I'm going to move on and show you a quick example of a song, but let me just talk about this. Out of the melismatic organum examples we just looked at, the discant organum, melismatic organum, and polyphony, and also those were in sacred settings, it led to the development of a vocal genre called the motet. And the motet is a vocal work set to poetry, basically, and it's usually polyphonic in nature. So some of the characteristics of motets were they were work for 2 to 4 voices, but 3 voices was the most common format. Interestingly, the motets tended to be secular works, but not exclusively. They actually started as sacred works, but then they were adopted by the court culture or the court society and then integrated into the secular repertoire. So for the motets, the lowest part is usually a chant melody drawn from an existing polyphonic work, an existing clausula. So it's like a polyphonic work using discant organum. So we have this borrowed material in these motets, and then on top of that sacred melody that was borrowed, there are secular parts put on top. And so the upper parts were using different texts, and usually in an old form of French. So the early motets had multiple languages going on in them. They had Latin in the lowest part, that would be the foundation for the composition, and then French
in the upper parts. And usually they use 3 different texts all at once. So it was pretty interesting in that. So there is a pretty complex type of music. Let's see. Now, let me show you an example of one of these. So this example here is by the troubadour Adam de la Halle. And you notice that this piece has 3 different titles to it. De me dama vion, Dio, comme un pois, and then omnes, which is Latin. So it's 2 of the titles are in French, and then the 3rd is in Latin. And if you just look at these parts here, even if you can't read music, you see that the note lengths and duration and contours and shape are all different. So they have 3 different melodies going on here. So this is really a truly polyphonic work. We have 3 independent melodies, 3 texts going on, and the theme is on courtly love. And the upper part is from the perspective of a woman. The poetry of the second part is from the perspective of a male in court, and then the bottom part is just kind of everyone. And omnes means all, actually, by the way, in Latin. So it's kind of representing everybody's kind of viewpoint in the court. So it's interesting secular work using borrowed material. And then here's some of the text. If you feel like pausing and reading some of that, you can. So that's the upper part, and here's the middle part, and then the bottom part is the tenor all. So it's interesting there. So if you want to pause and read about that, feel free. I'm going to play this really just quickly for you so you can hear what that sounded like. So let me just pop over here. Here it is. So, pretty interesting what's going on there. These works were basically presented to be entertainment for the court. A question you might have is, can you understand all 3 parts at once? Probably not. And so it was an intellectual game for the nobility to try to pick out the meaning and pick out the dialogues that were going on at the time between the parts. So this is just an example of the continued development of polyphony, but then within the court context, a secular context. So the early organum was a sacred example, where we had melismatic organum and discant organum, and then we moved to a secular example of a motet that was written by a troubadour, and then utilizing some borrowed material from chant, and then there are new parts written above that pre-existing chant melody. So that was really a common approach to writing polyphony, using pre-existing material and then writing new polyphony around it and elaborating on it. And this practice would continue well into the Renaissance. So we'll continue to look at the development of polyphony, and then we'll also look at the rules of counterpoint, the rules of music theory, how they start to develop over time and start to govern the consonances and dissonances that we hear when notes are working together in polyphony and polyphonic settings. So that concludes our lecture on early polyphony.